Welcome to Beyond the Powerline Road. Question today is, do you believe in God? And what kind of God do you believe in? And I know that sounds to be sacrilegious to some extent, but the problem with a lot of individuals is they establish their own God that they put on a pedestal. They put a God that is not always benevolent. They put a God before them that is not one that provides the providential leadership that we need as Christians. And sadly, we can kind of see that when we look at how many people actually believe in God in America. Turns out that the Gallup poll in 2022 found out that only 81% expressed a belief in God. This is down from 87% in 2017 and down from 98% in the 60s. So the whole concept of do we believe in God somehow is kind of going away in America. There are a lot of individuals that are not believing in an active God in their life. And just to add a little bit of insult to injury, the Baylor University, there were a couple of sociologists, and they wrote a book about America's four gods. And, their interesting thing is they did research and they found out that most people believe in one of four beliefs with their God. They believe that there is either an authoritative God, a God that engages in positive force of the world and yet is going to judge the behaviors of humankind. They believe in a benevolent God, or the second set of people believe in a benevolent God, a God that mainly is a force of good and answers our prayers or listens to our prayers and comforts our suffering. And then there is a group of people that believe in a critical God, a God that is less likely to be concerned about our lives and individuals, but will execute judgment. And then there's a group of individuals that believe in a distant God, and that is that God sets the laws in motion, of nature in motion, and he just does nothing. He just sits back and watches. And, the sad thing is I talked to a Christian individual, a brother in Christ, that tends towards that belief nowadays that, God just set everything in motion, and after AD 70, he's just watching things go. And I beg to differ. I would like to believe what Benjamin Franklin said, and Benjamin Franklin says, here's my creed. I believe that there is one God, the creator of the universe, and he governs by his providence, and that he ought to be worshipped. Good old Ben Franklin. When I was growing up, I had not heard the word providence until I went to college. Of course, part of it is I hadn't become a Christian until about 16, 17 years old and hadn't heard a great number of sermons about providence. But when I was in college, I had a history class. Amazing history professor. Sadly, I don't remember his name, otherwise I'd give him due credit. But the history professor talked about the providence of the founding fathers, and he, mentioned Alexander Hamilton and he mentioned Thomas Paine and John Smith, and he mentioned George Washington and Ben Franklin and Monroe and Jefferson and the whole bit, and he talked about the providence of God and how the providence of God was definitely necessary and essential in the founding of the republic that we enjoyed for years. And so what I want to do is I want to look at God's providential nature. And the first verse that comes to mind is in Psalms 145. Psalms 145, and I'm looking at 17 and 18 and 19, and I am going to be emphasizing 18. But in Psalms 145, it says, the Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works. And 18, the Lord is near to all who call him, and to all who call him in truth. And he fulfills the desires of those who fear him, for he hears their cries and saves them. God is very much actively involved, or at least he was during the time of Psalms. And if we look at the definition of providence, if we go and Google definition of providence, it says the care, guardianship, and control exercised by a deity, divine direction. So God's providence is something that we need, it's something that we should believe in, and it's something as to how we define our understanding of God. If you go to Nehemiah chapter 9, I think there's a very interesting couple of verses here. And this is Nehemiah chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. Nehemiah says, "You gave your good spirit to instruct them and did not withhold your manna from their mouth and gave them water for their thirst." And he's talking about Moses going through with the as Moses left Egypt and he's going through the wilderness. And in 21 it says, 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. Did you know for 40 years their clothes did not wear out because of God's providence? Now there's some definitions of providence on the internet in different places, and one of them I thought was kind of interesting because it contradicts what I just read in Nehemiah. And it says, understanding God's providence. It says, difference between a miracle and providence. A miracle is when God accomplishes his will by acting in a way that contradicts the law of nature. Providence is when God accomplishes his will through the natural forces of this world and through the free will of man. And what this individual stated, was right about the whole concept of providence through the natural forces of the world. But if we go back to Nehemiah, we found out that their clothes did not wear out. Hey, that contradicts the law of nature to some extent. So providential intervention is one that may be interpreted loosely as a miracle. There's a couple other verses. There's a guy by the name of Jerry Bridges, and Jerry Bridges wrote The Sovereignty of God's Providence. He has since passed. I think it was in 2016 he passed. And he's with a group called the Navigators, and I guess it was a bunch of different non-denominational church groups that try their best to provide help to individuals that need to be directed, if you will. And so he stated the providence of God is his constant care for and his absolute rule over all creation for his own glory and the good of his people. So let me say this again, because I probably didn't read it really well to you. The providence of God is his constant care for and his absolute rule over all creation for his own glory and for the good of his people. So there's two reasons the providence of God is there. One is for the glory of God. Of course, we know to God be the glory, but it's also to the good of his people. And then there was a statement that I found on the internet, and I cannot attribute the author to this one at all. It was a statement that had no one claiming it, but it is probably the best one I've heard. It says, trust the past to God's mercy, the present to God's love, and the future to God's providence. Wow, I don't know. To me, that is very powerful. I think it's wonderful. Whoever the author was, they truly sort of had a good understanding of God's active role on earth today. You know, and of course, when we talk about God's providence, When we look at the history of the United States, of course, you have the all-seeing eye of God on the dollar bill. You also have it in the seal, where the seal of the United States once was with God's favor, everlasting, and of course that was in Italian, but it was very important that they always took God's providence into account. So where do we see in the Bible an interesting story about God's providence? Well, the story that comes to mind to me is the story of Joseph. And so when we look at good old Genesis, it took me a minute for thinking where I was. When we look at Genesis and we see Joseph and Joseph's story, we can get a good idea of how God's providence works in life, or worked back then. And so if I'm looking at Genesis and I see, and I believe this is chapter 47, it says, "Now Israel loved God more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age." And of course, you know the story where, Jacob made the coat of many colors for his son Joseph, and his brothers were jealous of it. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. And behold, it was a dream about binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheaves rose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaves." And his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams. Well, that wasn't his only dream. He had another dream, and Joseph, being young, didn't know how to keep his mouth shut, probably, because this one got him in more trouble. He dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers, and he said, "Behold, I dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, 11 stars were bowing down to me." And he told that to his fathers and brothers, and his father rebuked him and saying, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed bow down to the ground before you?" So Joseph, being the ripe age of 17, should probably have kept his dreams to himself, or it seemed as if he should have, because his brothers now truly hated him. And his father didn't see that hatred, didn't thoroughly understand it, and his father used Joseph to go check on his brothers from time to time. And if we go to Genesis chapter 37, it says, "Now his brothers were to pasture the father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers pasturing the flocks in Shechem? Go check on them.' So he sent Joseph to go check on his brothers. And Joseph is wandering around in Shechem and can't find him. And a man found him wandering in the fields and said to him, 'What are you seeking?' He goes, 'I am seeking my brothers,' he said. 'Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flocks?' And the man says, 'They've gone away. I've heard one of them say, let's go to Dothan.' And so Joseph went to find his brothers. Now you can imagine the brothers anticipated that he is spying on them, finding out that they are not in the place they were supposed to be. I'm sure they didn't want little brother to cause them grief with dad. And it continues on, and they said they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They were ready to kill the little brother. But when Reuben heard it, remember Reuben was the oldest, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, 'Let us not take his life.' And Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood, throw him into the pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him.' And Reuben did this so that he might be able to rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father later on. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, and his robe of many colors, and they took him and threw him into the pit. And then they went about doing their things for a while. And what happened is the Midianite traders came and found Joseph before Reuben could rescue him. Then the Midianite traders, and by the way, I'm in verse 28, passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit, he saw that Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" And when they took Joseph's robes and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robes in the blood, they took the bloody robe back to Dad. And of course, Jacob was distraught. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to an officer of the Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. And we know that Joseph had some problems in Egypt, but I'm going to skip ahead 23 years. 2 years into the famine, people are having a very hard time finding food. The family of Jacob knows that there's food in Egypt, and the sons are sent to see if they can't purchase some food. And who is in charge of everything? None other than Joseph. And so we look at Genesis chapter 45. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near him, and he says, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold in Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there is yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you that sent me here, but God." And so when we think about it, we realize that, what they did to Joseph was terrible, and Joseph thought they sold him to the travelers. But what happened is, because of God's wonderful providence, Joseph was in a position where he needed to be in order to provide life-giving food to the Israelites. And so Joseph was there, and he provided for the family. He allowed the father and his relatives to settle in Goshen. And the chapter goes on, and we finally get to the life of Joseph and Jacob go on, and we finally get to Genesis 50. In Genesis 50, Jacob dies. And Joseph is in mourning, and the brothers are afraid. They're afraid that he remembers 40 years back when he was sold into slavery. And they come to him, and they fall on their knees, and they beg to be his servants, and, they carry on, and Joseph is really sad. And he tells them, he said, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So the providence of God provided a means for all those individuals that were related and associated with Joseph's family. The providence of God helped many, many, many people. And when we think about the providence of God, we tend to wonder, is the providence of God something that continues today? Because the founding fathers believed it did. But there are those individuals, there are those people that think that God set the laws of nature in motion and just sits back and watches. And then, of course, we also have the Ben Franklins that believes that God governs by his providence and that we are needing to worship God. So, is the providence of God active today? I will tell you, I truly believe it is. And here's my story why I believe it is. It involves an Irish setter and a New Holland baler. Now, a New Holland baler makes small bales. It makes bales that you can kind of lift with your hands. And what happens is it wraps the bales with twine, and you can stack the bales. And a lot of farmers back when I was into farming used these balers, and this is before the big round bales. I mean, big round bales were coming out at the time, but they weren't as prevalent as the smaller bales. So where does the Irish setter come into play? Just so happened that I had a dog that was an Irish setter, and the Irish setter wound up disappearing. And so I let my neighbors know that I could not find my dog. And so they were kind of on the look for him, and 2 weeks had gone by. And I'm out there baling. Hay in a field, and a bale breaks. Now, when a bale breaks, what you normally do is you stop the tractor, you get off, you go grab the hay, you haul it to the front of the baler, you rebale it, and you let that twine work again so that it can catch this particular time and give you a nice bale. So a bale broke, and I went to the back of the tractor, and I took this broken bale, and I carried it to the front. And unbeknownst to me, there was a hornet's nest in the bale. And all of a sudden, I am getting stung in my stomach and abdomen area all over the place. And so I tried to kick the bale into the baler. I bale up the hornet's nest one more time. I get to the end of the field, and I am feeling really, really weird. So I take off for the house, and I'm laying down because I'm not feeling well. Interestingly, a neighbor friend of mine took the day off of work, and he was driving by, and he saw what he thought was my Irish setter. So he gives me a call. And I answered the phone, and I guess I was just speaking gibberish. I wasn't making a bit of sense. And he had a very large concern because he knew that I didn't act that way normally. So he drove into my yard, came into my house, and here I was, eyes swollen shut. I could barely breathe. He took me, carried me out to his car, threw me in his car, and went like a bat out of heck to the nearest hospital. And because of the neighbor, I survived. And the interesting thing about it, had the dog not gone missing, had the neighbor not taken the day off work, had the neighbor not called me and found out that something seemed to be wrong, I wouldn't be here today. Providence or just luck? You decide. Have a great day.